Hi, I'm Josh Sandberg, a product manager here at GitLab, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities that we're thinking through within the monitor stage. So, as many of you know, of course, GitLab is a single application for the entire DevOps lifecycle, um, and monitor operates on sort of the far right side. So you'd capture ideas, build them, test them, deploy them, and then utilize monitoring to then take those learnings you get while it's operating your software and funnel them back into your planning cycle. So the real question is that this is a newer stage compared to, say, our create and verify, which would be our SCM and our CI/CD tools. And so how do we try and, given that we're a newer area with a very wide set of features, right, ranging from metrics to tracing to logging to error tracking to incident management to status page, right? There are entire companies in each of these categories. And so how do we accelerate the integration and enablement of these features so our users can benefit and hopefully reduce their cycle time and build better software more quickly and iterate more quickly so they can, again, learn and adapt and really get their features built the way their users are expecting and hoping for. So how do we, again, pull these in? We of course could try and build all these features ourselves. That would take way too long, and that's just not an option. And so we're typically leveraging open source tools in all these areas. We have a great integration with Prometheus. We're also integrating with Sentry and Jaeger and other tools. And so there's that kind of able to leverage those communities and the ecosystems and momentum behind them. But there's still the question of how do you then get that into GitLab? And one aspect that we're looking at is, sorry, I'm going to share the right screen here. One aspect we're looking at is whether we can iframe these to really, again, accelerate the integration of these tools, even if it means a subpar user experience for the first couple iterations on these features. In particular, you can see we're looking at, in this case, Jaeger, Kiali, and Loki. Jaeger is, of course, the CNCF project for distributed tracing. Kiali is a service mesh observability layer on top of Istio, and Loki is a newer logging kind of log management tool out of Grafana, which is really promising as well. So let's take a look at each of these individually. We already have some really basic integration with Jaeger today. So I can go into operations, click on tracing, and I'll get taken to my Jaeger instance here, for example. And so that's great. And it provides some value. I can easily get there. But the real question is can we, what's the next step and how do we pull this in? Well, in this case, we're kind of proposing iframe here, which I think for Jaeger actually makes the most sense. So for example, here's the Jaeger interface. We can, again, pull this in into GitLab, and it might not be super amazing, but there's an interesting path forward here. So Jaeger has actually built an embedded mode into their existing web interface. And so if you take this extra query parameter and put it on, say, the back of your query here, you will actually see the UI change and you lose that kind of search bar that you had on the left-hand side. And what this does is it allows, for example, GitLab to build that search interface ourselves and still leverage all of the amazing UI and business logic and components within the broader Jaeger interface. And so in this case, we can take advantage of the velocity and all the work going into Jaeger, and it's a great UI here, but still have it feel a little more natural to fit than simply taking the whole UI and just plugging it into GitLab. So I think, again, to kind of summarize on the Kiali, on the Jaeger side, a really interesting path forward would be to take what we have, which is a tracing tab in the URL configuration, enhance it so we can then iframe the whole thing as the next iteration. And then as the next iteration from there, GitLab can then build the sidebar and then have the embedded UI pop up on the right-hand side and make it feel more like a natural fit. So that's a really compelling, I think, sequence of operations there. Now, we do have to iron out, broadly speaking, for all these iframe solutions, security, and make sure there's a good security model in place, whether it's sandboxing or perhaps some warnings and things like that. But that's a great kind of path forward, I think, for Jaeger. And once we get to that embedded experience, we can then, of course, collect some more data, get some more user feedback, and figure out where to go from there. It is worth noting, however, that there are two features of Jaeger that are not currently, as far as I'm aware, available in the embedding mode, which is the comparison of two traces and the dependency graph, which is like a service map that Jaeger can build from the tracing data. So those two would not be available. But a really clean way of solving this is simply having the embedded experience within GitLab and then having a little button to jump out, of course, to the full Jaeger experience directly in that page, perhaps in the upper hand corner. And that can provide a nice experience to have an escape hatch out to go view the comparison or the dependency page, or for some reason there's some other feature gets added within Jaeger and we don't have it yet, you can always jump out from that easy link towards the full experience. So that's Jaeger there. I think, again, really compelling option. Moving on to Kiali. So Kiali, again, is a service mesh observability tool for Istio, and it can provide a really interesting service graph. And I generate some more traffic here for our sample application. And shortly, this will populate once the traces and the metrics populate here within Jaeger and Grafana. I'm sorry, Jaeger and Prometheus. You will notice here that Kiali does also integrate with Grafana and Jaeger as well. I have had a hard time getting all of the configuration options set correctly to work with that, so I do apologize. You get some warning messages, but I'll try and illustrate what it would look like based on some of the Kiali's documentation. So if we refresh a couple more times here, you'll start to see the service map populate. Now we have the tracing data coming in, and you'll also start to see some of the directional graphs, and as more data comes in, you'll also start to get some metrics based on the input and output metrics. And so you can see, for example, the rate coming in, how often you had 500s and 200s and things like that is all populated here on the right-hand side. So that should start to populate here shortly. As you can see, it's just waiting for a little more traffic to populate. But while we wait for that to happen, basically this is the experience, right? So you have the full Kiali UI over here. You can jump between a lot of different options over here between applications, workloads, services, as well as some configuration. And a lot of this gets into things like the actual Kubernetes sort of concepts and constructs, right? So I can go from workloads, jumping into pods, to services, and I can see labels. So there's actually quite a lot in here. But I think for GitLab, a lot of that is a core service map experience, but just great to have in general within the experience kind of as a first iteration. But to talk a little bit more about this as well, being interesting is that they actually also, again, I mentioned before, embed or integrate with Grafana and Jaeger. So if I jump into, for example, the services page, grab one of the, say the rating service, for example, I can actually go and look at the inbound metrics, and this will populate here shortly as well. Maybe we can grab a different service here, for example. Let me try details. All right, well, this will populate here shortly based on the incoming Prometheus data. But if I had Grafana hooked up, you'd also see a little view in Grafana tab here. So basically what they've done is they've built their own internal graphs, which can solve a decent amount of the use cases. But recognizing that it's not a fully comprehensive dashboard, they also have through the escape hatch out to Grafana. This is what it would look like once I have the Grafana link or Grafana integration hooked up. You get that little button to go jump out into the full experience. So that's a little bit of what that would look like, again, if I had that configured. And so it's a very similar pattern to what we actually already have for error tracking, where we have our list within the GitLab, and you can jump out to Sentry. We're kind of proposing as well for Jaeger with the escape hash to look at the dependencies and the comparison tool. And they've done exactly the same thing here as well. So it's quite interesting. Also interesting is that if I click on traces, they actually just pop open Jaeger. And so I think this particular build doesn't have maybe the embedding features that Jaeger made enable in 1.9, but I'm sure those are coming here soon. So that will then give you that, again, that kind of embedded experience versus the full just kind of tab that opens up. So I think the challenge, of course, here is on Kiali is that there is no embedded mode as far as I'm aware for Kiali that Jaeger has built. And so it's not going to be as natural of a progression from kind of the full embedded experience to becoming a little more seamless, like if we had that we built our own search parameters. And so iframe isn't as clear cut, I think, as a choice here. That said, there is a pretty extensive API. It does look like it's a kind of a public contract here, and so it shouldn't hopefully change very much. And so this is an option to try and get data out of Kiali and render our own service map if we want to. But again, that's still quite a lot of work. And so I think, given that GitLab is a low level of shame for first iterations, it might be interesting to iframe the Kiali interface as it is, collect some data, and really kind of determine and potentially work with the Kiali team to figure out what the best way forward would be. Would it be to build our own service map based on the HTTP API, or is there some embedded like model here for Kiali, like Jaeger built, that could work for GitLab and be able to leverage more of what they've done on the front end versus trying to rebuild it ourselves? So that's a bit there on the Kiali side. Of course, again, just knowing that there is some duplication here, right? So they have dashboards built in, they have Jaeger kind of being built in. We'd have those elsewhere within GitLab with our own metrics dashboard and our own Jaeger tracing dashboard. And so that's a bit of duplication, but obviously the advantage here is that you get some integration between the service maps and the dashboards and what you're seeing. If we have to make sure we replicate that as well, basically. There on the Kiali side. Moving on now to Loki. So Loki is a really interesting, again, logging solution. And the premise basically is that you don't really need oftentimes to have a fully reverse indexed logging solution. It's complicated, it's expensive to maintain, it's time consuming to maintain. It's hard to scale, oftentimes they fall over. And really, for most use cases, you don't really need that full indexed experience. And so in fact, what you can oftentimes get by with is a simple time span and a regex and some basic filtering on like what application, server, et cetera, came from. And that's really the premise for Loki. It's a sort of cheap and cheerful logging solution, which will have a lower cost of ownership, less time to maintain, effort to maintain, but still solve most of the use cases. So I can, for example, go over here, pick out some labels. These are labels that actually come from the same labeling system Prometheus uses. So you automatically get that matching benefit there. If you want to say, for example, look at the application Grafana and metrics as well as logs, you can easily do that, and they'll always match up because it's the same code base. So I can simply, again, grab Grafana here, and I can get the list of its log services coming through. So I can also do some simple filtering and say, okay, give me all the 404s, and you can see it's now done that and highlighted there in the text. So that's a really simple tour of Loki, but that's also largely what's available now. They do have some deduplication and some other features, but again, that's the primary experience there. Jumping back to GitLab, a lot of folks actually aren't aware that we actually have a decent logging solution, well, an MVC of a logging solution already in the product. And that's because we unfortunately do a pretty good job of hiding it. The first iteration was easier to sort of work off of the deploy boards workflow. And so if you go to deploy boards, you go to environments, and you see these little sort of pod indicators. You actually click on them, and you get taken to the logs for that pod, which is super helpful for review applications. If you're starting to see 500 errors in your review application, you can jump in and get the logs and easily and quickly without having to fire up, kubectl or something like that. But yeah, this is actually already baked into GitLab. And you can kind of see the interfaces aren't all that dissimilar. It's fundamentally, it's largely a logging solution. We just don't have the labeling experience up top. We instead have sort of the pod drop down, nor do we have the ability to filter within a given logging entry. But the advantage here is that this works just really with any baseline Kubernetes instance, right? The basic kubectl logs, which is what this is based on, works anywhere. And so you don't actually have to deploy software, maintain anything. It just works. So I think interesting here is that the MVC should actually be to make the existing pod logs feature just more discoverable and more usable. And so actually have a logging entry here on the left-hand side, and hopefully folks can get more use out of it that way. We also could explore potentially making it more discoverable on, say, like review applications as well. and really kind of leveraging what we have and the fact that it just works by default for everything. Now, it is worth noting that you do have to provide some matching rules so we can differentiate between different environments that might happen to be in the same namespace. The good news there is that I think in this release we're improving the labels that we match on to make them more easily configurable for your applications. Right now we're using the app label, and that tends to not be parameterized for most applications, in particular Helm charts. And so we're now moving to our own GitLab labels, which you can pretty much put anywhere easily, and that'll give you the matching experience you'd hopefully get and be able to see deploy boards and also see pod logs for the same reasons. And so we're improving those things there. But basically, making this more usable and more discoverable, I think, is a great first step, and it'll also lay the foundation, for example, the logging sidebar and things like that that we would anyway need for Loki. And I think also given the similarities and the fact that the UI isn't super complicated, and they already have a lot of it built, is a good way to kind of leverage what we have with GitLab. And so in this case, I don't think it makes sense to iframe Loki right now. Instead, we can have a bit of like a crawl, walk, run with the current logging solution. So users can take advantage of pod logs with minimal configuration, which also unlocks other features within GitLab like deploy boards. That works out, without anything installed, any extra dependencies. And that's a great first iteration to make it more discoverable, more usable. The next iteration could be supporting Loki, right? Allowing users to deploy it, and then basically having a little richer filtering experience once you have Loki deployed. So we could pull the log, we could pull the labels, we could then have the simple regex queries involved as well in the time span. And that really all that we would have to do, largely, I think, and to kind of pull it in into GitLab. So I think it's kind of a natural experience there of having a good baseline, and you can make it better if you then take the extra step of deploying Loki and having that run on your nodes. So a bit of an introduction there on Loki as well, and potentially some direction on how to go forward. That said, thanks for the time, I appreciate it. I would ask if you'd like to continue the discussion, please comment on our issues. They're largely findable on our direction page. You can go to about.gitlab.com/direction/monitor, and you'll see our entire roadmap. So please do, if you have commentary on these issues, on what kind of our plans, to let us know. If we're not, if there's other options available for how to integrate these, great, please let us know. We'd love to hear back from you, and thanks for your time. And looking forward to improving our monitoring tools together. Thanks.